Great, thank you. Awesome. Okay, so as we've mentioned, folks, we've got 90 minutes together today. First, I'm going to do an overview of the requirements. So in particular, what does Title IV regulation require institutions to be doing starting this July 1st? So we do have some important changes that are coming up here on the near horizon. There are some considerations related to SARA policy as well, and I'll touch on those when relevant. And then we have time specifically scheduled for questions. So about 25 minutes from right now, we'll go into the official question time. But as Nan mentioned, feel free to put your questions in the chat as I'm going through the overview, and we may address some of those as I go. But otherwise, you'll be able to come on camera or audio and ask your questions live if you'd like to, or go ahead and put them in the chat and we'll get to those. And then about the last 30 minutes of our time together, we would love to get into a discussion with everyone on how it's going implementing these Title IV regulations and getting ready for the changes in July. So I've got some discussion questions to help guide us there, but it really is your time together, and we're hoping that you will use it to pick each other's brains and talk through some of the challenges and things that you're working through at your institutions. We do have one slide about our services. That's not really the focus today, but if you want to get more information about how we work with institutions, that will be available to you through the slide deck. And then I do want to make note, while I am an attorney and we are talking about regulations today, I am not providing you with legal advice. Many of these issues do require some counsel, so I might point those out as I'm talking through them, but it is important to be working with legal counsel for your institution on many of these issues that we'll be talking about today. All right, let's jump into this overview of what is required. When we talk about these requirements and regulations, we like to break it down into three main responsibilities that institutions have. And again, this is under federal Title IV regulations, and then we have some related SARA policy that's relevant. First thing that institutions are responsible for is understanding if your programs meet educational requirements for licensure wherever you're enrolling students from, along with where your institution is located. And we're going to dig into each one of these here a little more detail, but that first responsibility is really the foundation. You have to understand if your programs meet the educational requirements in Iowa, along with other states and territories in the US. The second responsibility is be to certify that your programs do meet the educational requirements wherever you are enrolling students and where you're recruiting and advertising for those licensure programs. And this certify responsibility is the new thing coming online for this July 1st. And it is a heightened responsibility as compared to what we have today, which is really just about communicating. So that communicating responsibility still exists. That is the third responsibility that institutions continue to have under these Title IV regulations related to licensure. And the communicating is through public disclosures and individual direct disclosures. Again, I'm going to go into more detail on all of these here in just a couple of slides, but wanted to set up what the framework is for what we're talking about here. Okay, so this understanding piece, as I mentioned, this is the foundation. Institutions need to understand how your licensure programs meet educational requirements in each US state and territory, in particular where you're recruiting for that program, advertising that program, and most importantly, where you're enrolling students. So I'm going to pause here because there's a lot in that first statement on this slide. I'm going to unpack it a little bit. So what's a licensure program anyway, right? Well, unfortunately, we do not have a list of licensure programs provided by US Department of Education or anyone else. So ultimately, it's up to each institution to determine which of the programs you're offering are licensure programs. And some ways to think about that, we have some guide rails or guidance from Department of Ed. So as you're evaluating a program, you should consider what it's been designed for and what it's being advertised for. So if you've designed a program to prepare students for a professional or occupational license, or maybe to prepare them for an exam that's required for a professional occupational license. Those are things to consider there with the designing piece. Advertising, of course, if you have language in your description of the program or on your marketing materials or website where you're talking about a particular professional or occupational license, that would be a good clue. Another one would be if you are advertising it to lead to a specific profession or occupation or employment opportunity that would require a license. So those are things to keep in mind as you're evaluating your own programs to determine which ones of those are licensure programs. And I did want to take a beat here and explain licensure, because I know this can be confusing sometimes. What exactly does that mean? So again, we don't have a clear definition provided in the regulations or by US Department of Ed, but based on other information they do provide, this is really about a state or territory government issued or required credential to work in a particular profession or occupation. So we're talking about something that a state licensing board or a state agency would issue to a person in order for them to be working in that particular profession or occupation. These are not optional kinds of things, that could be issued by a private entity or organization or something nice to have that can help with employment opportunities. These are really things that are required by a state or territory in order to be working in that field. And it can be called other things. So licensure is sort of like an umbrella term here. A state could call it a certification, a certificate, endorsement, authorization, registration, the list goes on. So licensure is the shorthand, and I will be using that today. But if you hear license or licensure, just know in the back of your mind that that could be called something else by different states or for different professions. And really, the reason we have this kind of difference in terminology, and difference in licensure programs all boils down to that this is something that's regulated by states, right? So licensure is a state proposition. Each state and territory gets to determine which professions and occupations they're going to regulate, how they're going to regulate those, and the requirements that they have for someone to qualify for that particular license. All right, so I'm going to keep going here through this slide, but we're going to come back probably to recruiting and advertising. And I'll leave that there for now. I'm sure there'll be questions. So just as a reminder, I know that this has been a source of confusion as well. These regulations apply to all types of programs, all modes of delivery. So this is not just a distance education thing. These regulations do apply across the board to any of your programs that are licensure programs. And there is a connection to distance education with the new certify responsibility, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But broadly, generally, these requirements apply across the board to all of your licensure programs. And again, you do need to have an understanding of how your programs meet the educational requirements in other states and territories, along with Iowa, or if it does not meet them. Some of you who have been doing this work for a while are aware of this kind of third category of not determined or no determination made. So under the current 2020 version of these disclosure regulations, the Department of Education specifically required institutions to know and then communicate, if you haven't determined for a particular program. That is changing for this July 1, and I'll talk about that more with the communicate slide here in a moment. But I just wanted to point out here with understanding, you may still have some scenarios where you haven't made a determination yet for some of these states and territories or for some of your programs. That's going to be okay for a while, as long as you're not enrolling students that are located in that state or territory where you don't know, or recruiting or advertising for that particular program. And then longer term, some of you may have scenarios where you still have not determined or no determination made for some states and territories, depending on the type of program you're offering and the modality of that program where your students are located. All right, I'm going to move on to certify. Thanks, Dan. So, certify, as I mentioned, this is the new responsibility, the heightened responsibility that Department of Ed has put into place effective this July 1st. And this is something that's done through the Program Participation Agreements, the PPA. PPA is essentially the master contract that every institution has to sign with the US Department of Education in order to participate in the Title IV federal financial aid program. And so the PPA itself has been around for quite a long time, and there are a lot of provisions, a lot of things in there that institutions have to agree to do and not do. The new thing here is they've added a section specifically to professional and occupational licensure. And so, what institutions need to do starting this July 1st is be able to certify that any program you're offering that prepares students for licensure meets the educational requirements where the institution is located and where your students are located at the time of initial enrollment into that licensure program. Now, Department of Ed has included an exception to this second part here where the students are located. If you have a prospective student or an applicant who's located somewhere that your program does not meet the requirements or you don't know, you can still enroll them as long as you put them through your written attestation process. And that written attestation, this is a brand new thing. Again, we don't have particulars necessarily supplied by Department of Ed, and so it's going to be up to each institution to create your own process around written attestations, and then what that actual written, documentation is going to look like that you would be securing from these prospective students or applicants who are located in a does not meet or not determined place. And again, we can get into this later too. I'm hoping that some of you may be willing to share your thoughts and ideas on what you're going to be doing with this written attestation piece. Okay, so what else do I want to say here? Just to make it really clear, institutions cannot enroll students if they are located in a does not meet or a not determined state or territory unless a written attestation is completed. So how do we know where our students are located, right? Well, each institution needs to create a student location policy that is used for these purposes. And again, we don't have a particular dictated policy that Department of Ed is providing. Rather, we have kind of some rough guidelines of what the Department of Ed expects, which is you need to have a formal policy in place that helps you determine your students and prospective students' location, and that you're going to apply that policy consistently once it's in place, and that it would also be subject to regular reviews and updates, just like any other formal policy at the institution. And you have to be able to provide that to Department of Education should they ever ask for it. So those are pretty rough, broad guidelines, but it's something at least to start. And many of you may have a student location policy that's been in place since 2020 because it was part of the requirements under those 2020 disclosure regulations for licensure, and it helps you determine where your students or prospective students are located for those direct disclosure purposes. And I'll point out here, when you get the slides, we have provided a few examples of student location policies along with written attestations. These are really just meant to be something for you to look at. These types of things are not going to be cookie cutter templates, that you can take from one source or from one institution and just replicate, because there are so many factors that go into play with student location policy, along with the written attestation process. What exactly type of programs are you offering? What modalities? Where are your students located? Are you near a geographic border, and so you have commuter students versus, how many of your students are living on your campus? And there's other factors as well to consider when you're crafting these policies.
Chris,
Go ahead, Dan.
Okay, thanks. I did put a link to the example student location policies and written attestations in the chat. You can also activate the link when you get the slide deck, but if you'd like to look at it now, it's in the chat. And Kelsey asks, just to be clear, you cannot enroll, but it's not necessarily you cannot give Title IV funds.
Correct, right. So these requirements, it's a little complicated because we have to talk about individual students' locations, but the requirements are really tied to the program's eligibility to participate in Title IV. So if you consider that program a Title IV program, meaning that you're making Title IV funds available to any student who's in that program, then you have to make sure that all of your students are located in a MEETS state or territory, or you have this written attestation in place for them. So it's not just about the individual student's ability to access Title IV, it's about your program's eligibility to participate in Title IV. Great. Okay, let's move on to this third main responsibility that institutions have, and this is around communicating. So as I mentioned before, this has been around since July 1st of 2020, when Department of Ed first released regulations around professional occupational licensure disclosures. And Department of Ed didn't change a whole lot substantively here when they made the updates for this July 1st. You still have the responsibility to provide public disclosures and individual direct disclosures. So the public disclosures, these are typically done on an institution's website. Under the 2020 version, the Department of Ed had three categories that you had to list. So you had to list all the states and territories where the program meets educational requirements, those where it does not meet, and then the third category was this not determined or no determination made. So every institution today should have all 59 US states and territories listed in one of those three categories in your public disclosures. Well, the biggest change here the Department of Ed did make is they've removed this not determined or no determination made category from the required public disclosures. So starting this July 1st, institutions must disclose publicly any or all states and territories where you determine that the program meets educational requirements, and then all of those states and territories where you've determined it does not meet. So you're no longer obligated to publicly disclose those, third category, those not determined or no determination made states. You still could. We know that some institutions are going to continue to list those on their public disclosures, but you're not obligated to under the Title IV regulation. So something to keep in mind, again, you may be disclosing for all 59 states and territories still, or it may be less than that, because now we're in this scenario starting this July 1st, where it's really important to know where you're advertising for that licensure program or recruiting students for that licensure program. And again, most importantly, where you're enrolling students for that licensure program. And you should be able to disclose that you're meeting the educational requirements for any of those states and territories where you're enrolling, advertising, or recruiting. I did want to note the connection to SARA policy here. So we have SARA policy has been in place since 2020. I believe it was 2020, not 2019. It's been around for a while. So it's SARA policy 5.2, and it's really connected to the current 2020 version of these disclosure regulations from Department of Ed. And then SARA policy adds a little bit to that. So the most important things that are added here are if you're using a not determined category for your disclosures, then SARA policy says you should be making all reasonable efforts to actually make a determination first before you list it that way. And then if it's still not determined, you should be providing the board contact information for that state or territory licensing board or agency. SARA policy is in the midst of policy modification process for this year, and I know there have been some proposals put forth to update this policy 5.2, so we'll have to see what happens with that, but that process will extend out beyond July. So we'll have this current policy 5.2 in place for a while anyway, while these new regulations come online for July 1st. All right, so in addition to the public disclosures, you still have the responsibility to provide individual direct disclosures to prospective students or applicants and current students. As I mentioned before, these are connected to the student's location, and that is dictated by your own student location policy that the institution has put into place. So if you have a prospective student or applicant who is located in a does not meet or not determined state or territory, you need to send them a direct disclosure that indicates that before they enroll in your program. I did want to point out here, initial enrollment is another important term that Department of Ed has not clearly defined. So it is up to each institution to kind of set your own point in time of what you consider initial enrollment to be. We have some rough guidance from Department of Ed, which essentially is initial enrollment occurs when there's a substantial financial commitment to the institution. But you could set that initial enrollment point anytime before that substantial financial commitment. So again, some flexibility, a little window here for institutions to use. But you should know when your initial enrollment is. That's an important piece of information for these direct disclosures, along with the certify responsibility. If you recall, your responsibility is that you meet the educational requirements where students are located at the time of their initial enrollment in your licensure program. Okay, and then for current students, you have 14 calendar days to send them a direct disclosure if something changes and they're now in a does not meet situation. So they could move, change locations to a does not meet place, or something could change with a state licensing requirements and your program no longer meets it. Or even if you make some changes to your program, curriculum changes or something changes with your specialized accreditation for that program, that could put you in a does not meet scenario for states. So you have 14 calendar days once you become aware of that to notify any student who is located in that does not meet state or territory. All right, so some of you may have heard this electronic announcement the Department of Ed put out a couple of weeks ago. I need to update that slide. I noticed it says this week, so apologies. It was actually the prior week. So Department of Ed put this out, which basically is giving a little sliver of opportunity for some institutions if you're not going to be fully compliant with the new certify responsibility by this July 1st, that you could document any and all of those unique time-specific circumstances that are outside of the control of your institution. And you could use that documentation as a defense to any enforcement action by the department between July 1st and January 1st, 2025. So they've put this time frame in place, again, July 1 to January 1, 2025, where some institutions may have very particular, unique circumstances that they're documenting, which they could use to defend their non-compliance, should the department bring forward some sort of action around that. It's really important to know and understand this is not delaying the effective date of these regulations. So everything does go live, everything is enacted and effective this July 1st across the board. And also important to note, this is very specific to PPA certification. It's not about public or direct disclosures. So every institution, even if you have some of these unique circumstances outside of your control, you would still need to be in compliance with the public and direct disclosure piece on July 1st. This is not related to that. It's only to the new PPA certification responsibility. This is one of those areas where it's very important to have counsel. I mentioned I might point out a few of these. So if you think your institution could have some sort of unique time-specific situation outside of your control that's preventing compliance, then seek counsel on that and see what all you should be documenting and preparing for as evidence, should you need to use that for defensive and enforcement action. All right, so we are moving on to our official time slot for questions now. I'll ask Nan if we've had any in the chat come in, but otherwise, again, feel free to put yourself on audio or video and ask them live here.
Yes, Chris, we have 2 questions in the chat we can start with, but again, welcome anyone who wants to raise your hand or come off mute and ask it yourself. Let's start though with the question about what you just talked about with the Department of Education's electronic announcement. Would the current state of FAFSA qualify as unique and time-specific circumstance?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I'm just going to have to defer you to your own counsel on this one. I will say I had some written email with Department of Ed staff on this, including a member of their counsel's office. And it does seem like their expectation is it needs to be something relevant to the work required to comply with this regulation. But that's not spelled out clearly in the electronic announcement. So again, different people have different interpretations here, and you should definitely seek out counsel on that one if you have some circumstances around FAFSA that are really providing or preventing these compliance efforts from moving forward.
Thanks, Chris. Back to discussion about advertising. Under the new requirements or regulations, does having a website that lists the program mean that we are advertising in all 59 states and territories?
Yeah, another great question. So we don't have clear information from Department of Ed on this, on exactly what their expectations are around advertising or their understanding of advertising. But again, I will say some email communication I've had with Department of Ed staff, and I know others have as well. They seem to be most concerned about advertising that specific licensure program to people specifically located in a state where you don't know if it meets or not. So I hope that makes sense. But I think it's definitely not just having your website available to anyone on the web. That would seem to be a very broad form of advertising. I don't think the department's intent is to require people to just simply not advertise, certain programs on their website at all. It's seems to be more about really targeted efforts of advertising to students or prospective students in certain states.
We do look forward to hopefully more guidance from the department with their FAQ, don't we?
Yes, we're expecting the department to release something in writing, hopefully in the near future here. And my fingers are crossed that it'll include some more clarity here around advertising and recruiting.
Okay, a question from Kiera related to initial enrollment. We allow students to declare an education or nursing major for their first semester of enrollment at the university. However, they are not officially in the education or nursing programs until specific course requirements are met, usually in their 3rd semester. How should we define initial enrollment in this scenario?
Yeah, different institutions are approaching this differently. So as I mentioned, there is some flexibility around many of these things, including initial enrollments. So I know I've heard from some institutions that they're not going to consider those students initially enrolled until they're actually admitted to that licensure program. So, in the 3rd semester or 2nd year or whatever it is, for that particular scenario. So that point in time, that initial enrollment is when, again, they would need to be able to certify that the program meets the education requirements where the student is located. So in that 3rd semester or 2nd year, or whatever it is, per the student location policy. And they'd have to send any disclosures at that point in time as they're relevant. I also know institutions that are doing it kind of the opposite, right? So if you have people coming in that are declaring or giving you their intention that they plan to seek entry into these licensure programs later on, people are treating that as more of the initial enrollment time frame for those pre-licensure kind of programs. And then I know some institutions are kind of separating the two things. So they'll still have initial enrollment when they're actually admitted to the licensure program later on, but they're providing disclosures and information to these prospective students up front as they're inquiring about the program, and expressing their interest, so that everybody then is clear on, if the student's located and it does not meet or not determined state or territory, they're going to have to complete a written attestation in order to enroll when the time comes and they're actually enrolling in the licensure program itself. So there are lots of ways to set this up. There's not one specific answer, and I think each one, kind of has its downfalls or risks associated with it. So it will be figuring out for your students and your processes for admission, what makes the most sense. But the bottom line is, at some point, you'll have to have that initial enrollment timeframe. And at that point or before, you would have had to secure the written attestation if they're located and it does not meet or not determine state or territory.
Aaron has a follow-up question that I'm going to jump to, and then I'll go back to previous questions that were posted. Is there any standard language to include on an attestation form?
So again, we don't have, a form or a template or anything the Department of Ed has provided, at least not at this point. But we do know that their expectation is the written attestation clearly says that the student intends to seek licensure and employment in one particular meets state or territory after they graduate. So it wouldn't be enough for attestation to just say, I understand that the program does not meet licensure requirements in my state. That's not going to be sufficient. It needs to go beyond that, and the student has to attest that their intentions are they actually plan to seek licensure and employment elsewhere, and it has to name one particular meets state or territory for your program. So it can't just say, well, I'll seek a license somewhere where the program meets it. That also wouldn't seem to be acceptable. It has to have that specific designation and identification of one state and territory. So that's, again, kind of the rough parts of it. Nan had put a link in with some examples. Again, these are not meant to be templates to be, just replicated exactly as they are at your institution, but maybe a starting point as you're thinking about what language you would want to include.
Chris, so
yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
I need a little bit of clarification on that last statement. So it's not just about where this student comes from. It's also like, so if they come from California, I can see then, does our program meet California requirements? But they also can say that they're like, they can literally just pick places then, and we have to say whether it meets or not. Is that like, I'm just really confused about this nuance, and with what you just said made me kind of confuse me a little more.
Right. So the idea behind the attestation is to provide this exception to the limitation on enrolling students if they're located somewhere where your program does not meet or you've not determined. And so when the department talks about this in the commentary that they released with the final regs, I think the scenario they're thinking about is you have a prospective student who's located somewhere where your program doesn't meet, but that student already knows that they're actually going to seek a license and employment, let's just say in Iowa, like where your institution's located. So that attestation would list Iowa then as the state and territory. Or maybe they know, well, I actually want to work in Illinois when I'm done, right? And so you've compared your program already, you know that you meet Illinois standards. So that student could list Illinois on their attestation, and you would be able to still enroll them in your program. I don't think the department was thinking about scenarios where programs would not have made a determination, in a large number of states. And so then students are like saying, well, I want to move here or I want to be licensed here. The program hasn't made a determination yet. So then what happens? I don't think the department was thinking through that scenario when they set up this written attestation. Their underlying assumption is that prospective students, had this very clear idea of this is what I want to do after I graduate in this state, and that institutions would know basically everywhere where they were potentially attracting students from, if the program meets it or not. So it does make it complicated, Jeff, but ultimately, if you have a written attestation that identifies one particular state or territory where you've designated your program as meeting educational requirements, that would be sufficient under the regulatory requirement here.
Okay, thank you.
We have a few other questions on attestation, so let's stay with that for the moment. Leslie asks, but if our location policy uses Iowa as the location for all students, would you need an attestation for the California student?
Not if your student location policy is identifying all of those prospective students or applicants as located in Iowa. There would be no need for it. This is assuming that your program meets Iowa's requirements. I think, this is usually the easy one. If you're offering a licensure program, it's meeting your own state's requirements. Almost always, you often have to have some sort of approval, from a state licensing board or higher ed office around that anyway. So.
Chris, is that assuming then that California student is moving to Iowa?
Yep, I was just going to say that. So I think one thing to be cautious about, right, is it would be very disingenuous to set up a student location policy where you're treating any applicant for any modality of program as located in Iowa. In particular, right, like Nan was just saying, if they're not relocating to your campus to do a face-to-face campus-based program, but you're offering some sort of hybrid or fully online program, I don't think the department would look kindly on a student location policy that's treating that California student as located in Iowa. But if they are moving to Iowa to do your face-to-face campus-based program, that makes sense. And actually, Department of Ed provided some commentary around that when they released these regulations, that institutions should be able to take into consideration, information they're getting from that prospective student or applicant and what type of program it is as you're setting up your student location policy.
And Leslie put in the chat that they do not have remote programs, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
Another comment and question from Benjamin on attestation. Are we allowed to put a timestamp on the attestation about when the last time was that the licensure requirements in the other states were checked? If so, is there a limit to how long ago our institution checked those licensure requirements? Put another way, how often do we need to be checking other states' licensure requirements?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great thing to be thinking about too. So again, there's nothing in the regulation that lists a specific time frame or time period, excuse me, where institutions need to be reviewing or updating their research, to understand if they meet licensure requirements and any program comparison work that's needed. There's nothing specified. But what we typically say is you should build it into your annual processes, right? So if you think about other Title IV requirements, other reporting requirements for Department of Ed, and once a year is a pretty typical cadence for things. So at a minimum, at least, I would say build it as an annual kind of review process. I think putting a timestamp on the written attestation is an interesting idea. So like if you built in something where the institution would need to provide that information, obviously, to the prospective student, but to let them know the last time you reviewed requirements, I don't think there's a downside to that. It probably would be useful information for that prospective student, but it's also not a requirement that's spelled out in the regulation.
Hey, we had a previous post from Tom that really, I think, transitions well here. We have numerous licensure programs, and all of our licensure programs are offered only face-to-face in the state of Iowa. Due to our small size, we are concerned about our ability to monitor 58 other areas in a timely and accurate manner. Is there a risk of showing does not meet everywhere except Iowa?
So, the risks are probably ones that you've already identified, Tom, is, you have that then up on your public disclosures as does not meet, right? So if I'm a prospective student going out and researching programs and I see your program list meets for Iowa and does not meet for the other 58, I might be concerned if there's something wrong with the program or, why it doesn't meet. So I think the risk is probably unnecessarily losing some interest in your program and having that impact ultimately enrollment numbers. There's also potentially a risk around misrepresentation. Misrepresentation is another part of Federal Department of Ed requirements that apply to all institutions. Um, if you haven't tried to assess your program compared to other state standards to see if it actually meets or not, and you're just listing it as does not meet, are you really making a full true representation there? I don't know. There could be some risk. It's probably pretty small at the end of the day because you're being more cautious, right? Rather than making a claim that you meet in all these places when you don't have anything to back that up. But could potentially be a risk there too. So again, it's up to each institution to decide how you want to approach these. But if you are attracting students who are coming from other states outside of Iowa for your program, you wouldn't necessarily have to put all those other states and territories as does not meet. You can leave them as undetermined. You could still disclose publicly as undetermined if you would like to, or you would just not have them on your list, right? So you would have Iowa's meets and then not list any other state or territory.
Tom, do you have a follow-up?
We're just getting some feedback here, Tom.
Tom went off mute. I'm going to actually put you on. I think I can mute you. There we go. Okay.
Sorry, Tom, audio issues. If you were trying to ask a follow-up there, we were just getting static on our end.
Put it in the chat, Tom. Tricia asks, and again, this is a similar thread here, for programs that are advertised as leading to an Iowa endorsement, would we be required to certify those for other states?
Yeah, so the teacher programs are interesting ones, and they kind of come with their own challenges and issues around this work sometimes. So I do understand that for an Iowa institution, you've designed your program to meet Iowa's teacher standards. You have approval from the Board of BOEE, Board of Educational Examiners. So I understand all that, but really, if you have students that you're enrolling that are located in other states and territories, again, per your student location policy, you would need to be able to say you meet the educational requirements in those other states and territories. Or if you're doing some sort of specific recruiting activities or advertising for that particular licensure program elsewhere, you would need to be able to say you meet. But generally, Department of Ed has made it clear, again, in the commentary they released with these final regulations, that there's no expectation that all institutions for every program would need to know if their program meets in all 59 states and territories. It's really about those three key activities, right? If you're enrolling students from those states and territories, or recruiting for that particular licensure program, or advertising for that licensure program. So hopefully that makes sense, but keep that in mind as you're figuring out which states you actually do need to make those educational requirement comparisons for and determine that you meet.
It is confusing, and the next two comments and questions really show this. And I understand the confusion. So Tom had the follow-up, but website advertisement essentially causes them to be in all 59 areas. Anyone from anywhere could go to their website. So duty to all.
Yeah, again, I wish we had some more specifics here. Hopefully Department of Ed will put something out with their frequently asked question or Q&A written document that we're expecting. But again, email communication I've had with staff around this, it doesn't seem like they're trying to require all institutions to know for all 59 US states if we're just talking about your general website, right? So you have your institution's website where you list all your programs, you have a program page, that goes into the details for that. That's a pretty general way to be communicating your information out there to the world. And you're right, anyone from anywhere can access that, from anywhere in the US or anywhere in the world can access it. But I don't think that's really what the department's concerned about. I think they're concerned about more specific, targeted advertising. So like, let's say, I'm going to get out of my depth here quick, but I'll do it anyway. So if you're doing some sort of social media advertising, right? So you're trying to target certain types of people located in certain places, right? Like I know that there are people very smart in this who set up those geo-targeting campaigns, and you're targeting certain professions or people with certain things listed on their background, things like that. So that's probably more of what we're talking about here, is if it's targeted approaches to things rather than just your general website that's available out there to the world.
Lots of questions in the chat. And if anyone wants to raise their hand and talk directly, that's fine too. Christina asks, so if a program is entirely on campus and face-to-face, our student location policy can specify that we consider any prospective student in that program to be an Iowa student. Thus, we would need only certify and disclose that the program meets requirements in Iowa, and no individual disclosures would be required. Does she understand that correctly?
That sounds like it's in line with requirements. Yes, I do want to point out here though, I mentioned it at some point at the start. Do keep in mind any commuter students. So I'm not sure where you're located in Iowa, whoever asked that question, but if you're near a state border, and so even if you have commuter students who are coming, to your face-to-face campus-based class, I would say that gets more messy if you're treating that person as located in Iowa under your student location policy. I know some institutions are planning to do that still, even with the commuter thing. But I just wanted to point that out for consideration. If you've got somebody who's always residing in another state and they're coming onto your campus, it gets particularly messy when we throw in that distance education consideration, which I now realize that I didn't even mention. Sorry about that during the certify slide that I was talking through. So under the new PPA certification regulation, the Department of Ed's language says institutions must certify where the institution is located and where your distance education students are located. The reason that I don't focus on distance education there is because of the way Department of Ed's defining distance education for this. They're using a definition provided in a May 2023 Dear Colleague letter. It's really focused on accreditors in distance education. But in that letter, it says any student taking one or more class online is considered distance education. And so through some further email exchanges with staff, really where Department of Ed is at is if you have a student who's taking or could take one or more class online during the first term of that licensure program, then they're considering them distance education students for these purposes. So again, the reason why I don't focus on that anymore is I think it just confuses people. If you instead focus more on your student location policy and where your prospective students are located, that's going to put you, I think, on the right track and way to think about these things, because so many institutions have options for any of their students to take an online class during that first term of enrollment anyway, right? So we're just kind of applying this to all students rather than trying to carve out who's a distance ed student for these purposes or not, And then you have other definitions of distance education that you're using for other things for those same students. And it quickly becomes super confusing. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that. But if you think about all your students, then you're certainly going to be covering any distance education students and will meet the requirements there.
That's a lot. So any questions, let us know. I'll move on to Holly's question. Our institution just approved a Master of Arts in Psychology program that is not intended to be a licensure program. Do we just need to state that this is a non-licensure program?
Yeah, that would be a great idea to have really clear language in your description of the program or in your advertising or marketing that this is not a licensure program.
Kelsey has some questions about determining which programs to report on, which programs lead to licensure. Might be easier to ask out loud. Does that mean you want to get off mute, Kelsey? And
yeah, if that's okay.
great.
So I'm at one of the four-year schools here, and we've got several programs, and I think I've heard you speak to this before, but I'm thinking mostly about accounting and our College of Engineering. You don't have to be licensed to get a job with those degrees. Like the number of students that graduate with an engineering degree that actually sit the PE and the FE, it's very low compared to the number of graduates with accounting. You can still get a job working for Deloitte without being a CPA. So like, do those programs need to be reported on if there is a part of the career field that may need licensure, but you can in fact work in the field without a license? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yep, that totally makes sense, Kelsey. And you're right. These two come up quite a bit. What do we do with our accounting programs? What do we do with our engineering programs? And I'll say different institutions are coming to different conclusions on this. So I don't think we're going to have a situation where everybody's doing this the same way for these types of programs. What I always come back to is what has that program been designed to do and what is it being advertised to do? Those are really important things to consider. So, if you talk to your program director for the engineering programs and, if they say, well, we've designed it for around these different things, and sure, we know that people can use the program to help qualify to sit for the licensing exam, but that's not really our focus. We're not requiring our students to take that exam. It's not something that we're necessarily even heavily encouraging. It's just kind of out there as an option, and sometimes we talk to them about it. That seems like it's maybe not designed for licensure, in my opinion. And then the next thing would be, how are you advertising it, right? So if you have things in the program description that are talking about engineering licensure, or if you're somehow advertising that, then that becomes a problem because you're advertising it. So I know some institutions are choosing to revise language on their websites, and their advertising materials, just to make it clear that this is not intended to lead to a license. It's not a licensure program. And then they're removing engineering from their list of licensure programs because it wasn't designed for it. They're not requiring students to take that licensing exam. They're not advertising it. And it is more of an option, it seems, especially for those, undergraduate engineering offerings. So that hopefully that helps. But unfortunately, there's not a clear yes, it absolutely needs to be, and no, it doesn't for engineering. I think accounting's a little bit different. For undergraduate accounting programs, there are very few around the country that can meet any state's licensure requirements. And that's because all states require 150 semester hours,
Right.
semester credits in order to qualify. So truly the bachelor's, the undergraduate accounting has not been designed. If it doesn't have 150 credits, it hasn't been designed to meet those educational requirements for licensure in Iowa or anywhere else. So that design one is clearly off the table. So then you're left with the advertising piece, right? How are we advertising it? Again, I know a lot of institutions are taking a look at how they're describing it in their catalog descriptions and on their website, and just making sure it's clear that this program is not designed to get you to a CPA license. It's designed to help prepare you maybe to be on the start of a longer pathway to get there, right? So coming up with some language where it's clear that CPA is not an intended outcome of the undergraduate program itself.
Great. This will be my last question. I think it will be really, really fast. I'm sorry to everyone else. So with some of these programs that may sit in some murkiness, like if we were to put together standard operating procedures or sort of a document that talked about how we're working through all of this, and we had maybe a little explanation in there for why we're not including certain things, if we got scrutinized, would that be helpful if we say misinterpreted something, but you could see our like defensible reason that we came to that decision?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Documenting any of these decisions could only be helpful in the future. And certainly like the language you were just using, Kelsey, right? If it's a defensible, reasonable approach to something and you're kind of providing the notes on, here's how we got to this decision, here's the rationale, certainly would be helpful if there were ever any questions from anyone on why something's not on your list of licensure programs.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sarah, go ahead. I see your hands up.
Thanks, Chris. I have one that relates to the healthcare and social work professions. In the proposed new regulation 668.16R will require that an institution provide students with geographically accessible clinical or externship opportunities that are related or required for completion of the credential or licensure have to be done in a recognized occupation within 45 days of the successful completion of the other required coursework. A lot of times placements in these areas such as nursing or physical therapy are very limited. How can we have students who complete these requirements after the placement when there aren't any openings for them to do so? And what happens if a student can't get into placement due to limited openings again within that 45 days?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So this part of the regulation was part of the same package, if you will, that Department of Ed released back in October, but not within the same sections here that we've been covering so far about licensure and certification, but obviously one that's very impactful to programs. So I'll say that all I know is what I've read from the regulation and the commentary the Department of Ed provided. And they do seem to be expecting that institutions will facilitate these placements within 45 days. There does not seem to be any sort of exceptions made for particular types of programs or professions or special considerations, given for different scenarios. Again, this is just from the regulation language itself and then the limited amount of information in the commentary. In the comments, they recognized, people had provided public comment that this 45 days is going to be a real challenge, especially for some programs. And the department just frankly kind of dismissed that. So I don't have a whole lot of other information on this, but I'm just acknowledging, yes, this is definitely a challenge, especially for certain types of programs and certain professions. But this also is going into effect this July 1st. So if you haven't heard about it yet, important to find it quickly and understand how it could apply to your programs. But basically, any of these licensure programs that we're talking about today would fit into that. So if you have some sort of supervised experience, a practicum or internship or student teaching or something that's required as part of the program, you would have that 45 days to get that student successfully placed and started on that experience after they finish the other requirements, the classes and other requirements for the program.
Thanks, Chris. So it basically sounds like the government is kind of quoting Larry the Cable Guy, just get her done. basically, is there's no excuse, there's no, you're just gonna have to do it and move forward. Is that how I'm understanding? It's very clear cut that you just have to do it.
It seems to be. Again, there's the possibility the Department of Ed would release, some additional guidance or information or something. So I do encourage folks, if this is going to particularly impact your institution, you can contact Department of Education staff with questions about this, or your own comments or highlighting challenges. I know for certification procedures, which is where these disclosure and certify things live, I know the staff person for that. I'm not 100% sure on who the staff person is for this one, but you could always start with Vanessa Gomez is her name, the staff person for these changes. I'm sure that they would get it to the right person if this is
Awesome.
not
Thank
in
you
her
so much,
purview.
Chris.
So
I'll find Vanessa's contact information and put it in the chat. A follow-up from Dave on this for either Sarah or Chris, or anyone actually. What about in teacher preparation, students who complete coursework in the spring and will start and will student teach in the fall?
yeah, great question, Dave. I'm sorry, I don't know what to say about that. So the regulation language itself, again, it doesn't really provide exceptions for certain fields or programs or anything.
Good questions, though. We have 3 others in the chat. I know we wanted to move into discussion as well. But let's take these questions and then perhaps move into discussion so you can hear from each other on where you're at and what you're doing to address July 1 requirements. Megan asks, a selling point we often use on our licensure program web pages is that our program meets the licensure requirements for A, B, and C state. But we can work with students to help them easily transfer or obtain your license for other states, in other states. Are we allowed to still use that generic language?
You would need to have somewhere listed the actual disclosures. So I wouldn't think that kind of that list of we meet, A, B, C, D state would quite be enough. Definitely encourage a separate sort of web page or portion of the page where you're going to be listing those meets and does not meet state and territories for all of your licensure programs. So basically our recommendation is to have one consolidated web page where that's your disclosure page, and you're going to list for all of your licensure programs that you offer. You would have those listings of meets or does not meet, and maybe not determined if you're going to continue to do that for each of those really clearly there. The reason that we make that recommendation is because you can also put on that one centralized web page important context and other information, right? So even to be really clear, like the purpose of the web page is to provide public disclosures under the federal regulation. There's other important things for licensure to know about, right? Students have to be aware that it's not just completing your educational program, but there are other requirements that they'll have to satisfy, such as licensing exams, maybe some supervision or work experience outside of the program, additional trainings, CPR trainings or other things that wouldn't be part of a higher education program that are required. And then background check too, right? Like a lot of these licenses, if you have a certain criminal record or history, you're unfortunately not eligible for a license. So it's important to point out those high level things, at least in a summary at a high level, so that your students and prospective students are aware of that too.
Chris, I just received a emergency phone call, so I'll be right back.
Yeah, no problem, man. Everything's okay. So I think what I'm going to do, just in the interest of time, I know we have more questions in the chat, and I think some of them are related to this 45-day piece that Sarah brought up, which I'm glad you did, Sarah. And I also feel not as well equipped to address. So we can maybe circle back to some of those after the meeting today. But I am going to I'm going to shift us into discussion. So Nan's got control of the slides here, which is totally fine, but we'll just discuss without slides. We don't need slides. Basically, I just wanted to know if any of you are willing to share how you're tackling some of these things. So oftentimes we've heard when we've done these sessions for other states that some of the biggest challenges with this work is around doing the research to know what the other states' requirements are, and then to compare your programs to those requirements. Both of those things are very time-consuming, involved work, so we understand why that's a challenge. Anybody want to share the kind of process or framework that you're using at your institution for tackling these? So digging into the research on what those educational requirements are in other states, and then doing comparisons to your programs to see if you do indeed meet those requirements or not.
So Chris, as part of IACTE, we have actually agreed to start working together, actually from some work that was done at Clark University, that had started kind of looking at this stuff as part of NC SARA a couple years ago. And what we've done is we're dividing up, we have already divided up the states and territories between the 30 different school or colleges of teacher ed. And we're going off of kind of that document that Clark University had started, and we're adding, whether we're the met, not met, the additional things that they would have to do, links to the licensure sites in general. And then I'm working with a couple of other people to create the attestation, like a sort of a framework document, and also the website language that we're going to share out throughout the whole state for people to use as their baseline, because there was no point in all of us doing this separate work. There's too much of it. And so I think we're in a really good space right now to have that stuff done. Now, there's a lot of questions still, like, how are we going to house these attestation documents, where and when, and of course, when do we indicate because all programs have different points of admission. Like for us at the University of Dubuque, we're going to, that admission will be when they're admitted into our program, which is about a year and a half into it. But we have kids who come in and switch all the time. And so we're not doing this until we know that and if they come in and they automatically say, I'm going, pre-education, then we can do that document at that time. And our thing is we don't have a huge amount of students. Bigger universities, they're going to have even more work to do on this. But as a collective, I think we're going to have we've already been communicating since the spring conference at IACTE, and getting things ready to roll out to different schools so that they can make them their own, and then have that work done. So that's kind of our plan right now. A number, and it'll be for every organization in Iowa, every teacher ed program.
Yeah, great. That's excellent collaboration. I mean, I'm so glad to hear that, because you're right, Jeff. Just the sheer volume of work is too much. So glad to see that you all found a way to tackle that together, and save quite a bit of workload on everyone's shoulders. So great. I think Sarah maybe has control of the slides now.
Yes, I'm sorry. I hit a button just to test it, and yeah, but please let me know when you're
Great.
ready to move on, Chris. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, maybe since you do, if you want to pull up the discussion question, Sarah, I think it's the slide after the next one here on the screen.
While she's doing
There
that,
we
Chris,
go.
I might just mention my understanding for the 3 Regents institutions is that we will be coordinating in some way to make sure that all 3, Iowa State, and UNI, have similar policies in place. So again, kind of speaking to that collaborative spirit, I think we're all going to need that as we take on this task.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Kristen. That makes a lot of sense too. And for those of you who are at other institutions, right, where you're more independent and maybe aren't part of these collaborative efforts, do encourage you to, as you can, seek support elsewhere, and and share information and tactics. And that's part of why we wanted to do this discussion today, is to at least start that conversation and pinpoint people that would be good resources for supporting you with this work. So. All right, so I already threw out those first ones. If anyone else has things you want to share about how you're tackling the research at your institution or those program comparisons, feel free to jump in. Otherwise, I'm going to shift us, I think, to the second one, because this is, again, there's a lot of flexibility and options here around some of these things, including defining initial enrollment, and then, of course, your student location policy, what that exactly is going to look like, how you're going to treat different groups or different types of students for these purposes. So anybody want to share what you're considering initial enrollment? I know, Jeff, you just referenced, you're kind of setting that at the point of admission to the teacher preparation program, which makes a lot of sense. Other folks have other thoughts or other types of programs that you're thinking about and how you'll set that initial enrollment timeframe?
Chris, we have in the chat that Kelsey is saying that we're thinking about setting it at the point that the first tuition bill is issued. And Megan says at the graduate level, I would suggest we consider initial enrollment once the student makes their confirmation deposit.
Great. Yep. Again, kind of keying it on that financial commitment piece, right? That makes a lot of sense. That is sort of the rough guidance Department of Ed has provided. So as long as you're setting that initial enrollment date at or before that point of financial commitment, that's great. Maybe for Kelsey and Megan, it seems kind of similar, right, approaches to this, setting it around tuition bill or confirmation deposit. For either of you, are you planning to do any of the disclosures or any kind of interaction with the student around licensure limitations or the written attestation piece before that point? I'm also may not understand like how quickly somebody gets to that point, but just curious if there are thoughts to basically, separate some of this out, or if you plan to do all of the disclosures and written attestation and everything right at that point of initial enrollment.
I think that at one of the things that we've kicked around at Iowa State is putting in some sort of disclosure piece to somewhere in the admission and recruitment cycle for our programs that lead to licensure, at least for on the undergraduate side. Haven't dug really deeply into the graduate side yet, so that in some of the messages that students are getting, there's a specific link to the website calling them to look at it or something like that. So there's some sort of notification going on through that, and so hopefully that would be considered appropriate. And then I think the time of initial enrollment, like that's when we would trigger maybe a more specific email that says you're in a program that leads to licensure, something that doesn't sound scary, but is clear, but is also written in student language so they don't get scared about something. I'm kind of generally against sending students, or I worry about sending students emails that have a whole bunch of like legal speak in them because they don't understand them and it just causes worry. And I don't want any sort of these direct notifications to cause undue outreach about something that is fine. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense, Kelsey. I mean, you're absolutely right. Anytime there's something that has the potential to scare students, I think it makes a heck of a lot of sense to really think carefully about the language and when it's going to be sent and how, and who's available for follow-up questions, right? Because some of them will still have follow-up questions, even if you make the language as student-friendly as possible. So those are all really important things to think about for sure.
Chris, we have a follow-up from Megan. After graduate student deposits, I send them a next step email with registration information, orientation information, etc., and will perhaps just also include the disclosure info in that same email so that it's not in so many emails. I imagine the location policy form will need to be filled out prior to that point, though.
So
Would it,
by location,
so yeah, the location would it
location
need to be
policy,
complete?
yeah.
Mhm.
If you mean like if a written attestation is required for that student, Megan, if that's what you mean by that, you would need to have that written attestation secured at the time of initial enrollment or before. So it sounds like since you're defining initial enrollment at the point where they do their confirmation deposit, that would be an appropriate time to secure that written attestation if it's needed. That's also the point in time where you would be certifying, and I'm using air quotes because you don't actually have a document that you fill out for each individual student to certify that your program meets the educational requirements. The requirement is as part of the PPA certification process, which happens on different cycles at different institutions. So it could be once a year, it could be every 3 years. I think I've heard it even goes up to 6 or 7 years for the PPA certification renewal. Technically, when that PPA is signed by someone at your institution, that's when you're certifying that your programs meet the educational requirements where all of your students are located. So you won't have an individual kind of documentation or form for every single student if they're located in a meet state. But if they're located and it does not meet or not determined, you need to get that written attestation from them, which would be that individual student's document and retained within their record. And you would need to be able to make that available to Department of Ed if they would ever ask for it, that actual written attestation from that particular student.
Our question, we have another question. This one's from Joan. Can we base our meets for a program in another state on NASTech reciprocity?
Thanks for bringing this up, Joan. We hadn't touched on this one yet. So Department of Ed did reference licensing compacts and reciprocity agreements in their commentary that they released with these regulations. So we don't have anything in the regulation language itself, but in their comments, the department gave an example around teacher licensing and using the NASTech reciprocity agreement. They didn't name it exactly, but that's what they were talking about. So somebody who completes your teacher preparation program in Iowa, and then maybe they earn an Iowa license first and take that to another state and use that as a basis to apply. Maybe they don't earn an Iowa license first, but they've completed your teacher prep program and then go apply for a teacher license in another state. Department of Ed said that you can utilize reciprocity agreements like this as a factor when you're making a meets determination or it does not meet. So for teachers, this one's really important because it is the mechanism that allows teachers who complete programs in other states to satisfy educational requirements elsewhere. As all of you with teacher prep programs know, right, every state has their very own prescriptive standards and requirements for what they expect to be included in a teacher prep program. And they can be quite different from state to state. So this NASTech reciprocity agreement is very important. I'll just throw out a word of caution. Even with the NASDAQ agreement, it is important to know how those receiving states will evaluate your graduate's application and transcript still. So through our research, we know that there are still some states, even though they participate in NASDAQ, they've set up their own still very specific classes or coursework that they look for applicants coming from out of states. So there are instances where you would need to compare your curriculum to another state's courses or classes and or student teaching experience still to make sure that you qualify. but the NASDAQ reciprocity agreement can be factored in, so that you can, essentially you have an ability to say that you can meet other states' requirements. Without factoring in NASDAQ, it would be very hard for teacher prep programs to say they meet in any other state, honestly. So NASDAQ's on the table. Similar for other licensing compacts, if it allows your graduates to qualify for a license issued by another state or territory, that can be a factor that you use to help make a meets determination. And with any of this, however you're deciding that your program meets or doesn't, you'll want to document that thoroughly and then keep the documentation somewhere that's accessible to the right people should you ever need it for an audit or request for information from the Department of Ed or elsewhere. Right. We ended up covering a couple of really great things there that were not on my discussion, which is awesome. So if people do have other questions you want to bring forward in the next few minutes, feel free. Otherwise, I think what we'll do, Sarah, if you're able to, we'll try to do the next poll, I think, before we wrap up, if you're willing to try that with me from your end. You can see the rest of the slides there. So when you have access to the slide deck, we do have resource slides. We have all of the actual regulation language as well as links directly to the federal code. We have some additional resources that are also provided, including some recordings of webinars that we've done with MHEC. Thanks, Sarah. Looks like there's some technical challenges here. Sarah's accessing Nan's screen to try to do the slide, so a little bit of a challenge. There we go.
Is it this poll?
All right. Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There's one question that came in the chat that we'll do first, and then we'll do this poll here. So Kara's asking, is anyone aware of a collaborative effort going on with nursing programs in Iowa, so much like the teacher prep programs are doing? Anybody on the line aware of any collaborative efforts around nursing? Not seeing anyone jump and raise their hand, which leads me to believe probably not, but could make a lot of sense. Kara, should people contact you if they would like to try to create a collaboration here on this?
I would be very dangerous in that role because I'm not with the nursing division, but I'd be happy to help connect people in nursing divisions together because I think, again, many hands make light work and nobody has time to do all of this. So I would, I guess, welcome a conversation if anybody would like to start one.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for volunteering. It looks like Shannon may be interested. Some other folks are in the chat too saying they might be. So, all right. Great connections here today.
I'll put my email in the chat. So if anybody just wants to email me directly, maybe we can get something going with our nursing departments.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Well, we're rounding out our time here today. So we do have a poll for you to take. If you haven't used Slido before, you can scan the QR code that's up on the slide in front of you right now, and then do that poll on your mobile device, or you can go to slido.com 2561206. And we'll give you just a minute or so here to access those, and then I'll ask Sarah to click on the present link, and we should be able to see things live then as you're putting your answers or your thoughts in. So this is going to show up as a word cloud if you want to put a few words or a short phrase on what's your first order of business with this work after today's session. All right, I'm hoping this works. Are you able to click on the present link, Sarah? Awesome.
All right.
Here we go. Ooh, someone's having a margarita. All right.
That's one of the best answers I've seen so far.
Me too. Me too. We haven't seen that one yet. I love it.
No,
So
we haven't.
thank you. We have some other folks still typing here, so continue to put in your answers. Again, you can do that through slido.com 2561206 or scan that QR code there. And it's pulling
I
them
like the
together
one that
here. It looks
says
like
get
we
organized. You know, this is something that we'll definitely need to have some steps laid out and everything. So getting organized and, you know, discussing with colleagues on how to start that. Yeah, all great answers.
absolutely. I see someone wants to crawl under their desk, so I'm sorry to leave you with that feeling after this. Do though check out, you know, these slide deck once you have access to it. We've included, like I said, some additional resources and support, including recordings of webinars we've done and that other folks have done around this work that could be really helpful. I know Sarah put it in the chat earlier, but we're also doing another webinar on this topic next week on April 30th through MEC, and you can register for that on MEC's website. We're going to do 30 minutes at the top of the hour focused on leadership really as our audience. So if you're one of those folks that do not have great support from your leadership, maybe see if you could encourage them to come for that first 30 minutes. And then the last hour, we're going to really dig into implementation. So a lot of the things we talked about today, maybe we'll have the Q&A out from Department of Ed, and that would be great if we get that before next week so that we could talk about that in the webinar too. And you can always contact us with questions and ideas, and you know, we're happy to talk about this stuff. This is all we do. So thanks, Sarah, for hosting us today. Appreciate
Oh,
it.
thank you. Thank you. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. Again, the session has been recorded, and as soon as I get it to our communications director and she has time to put it up, she will, along with the slides. So again, thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day.
Take care. Bye.